Very, very, very nice. Sorry, I'm late. I don't know anyone else is, so okay. Last week we had an excuse. I forgot to remind everyone, but this week I remembered. So no excuses. All right, we are going to get started. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es taraso Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right, we are in the thick of this story, this piece of our history concerning Rus and Boaz. So let us remind ourselves what is happening here. So Rus had chosen, she was a Moabite princess, married to Machlon, this Jewish man from the tribe of Judah, very noble, wealthy lineage, who had, in a sense, abandoned his people, and with his father had gone to the lands of Moab, the enemy, during the famine. Seemingly, Rus, to marry him, had accepted Judaism, and she had accepted it sincerely because 10 years later, when her husband died, and her mother-in-law said, well, go back to your people, go back to the palace, get married. You know, you're relatively young, you're 40 years old. You can get married and have a new husband. You can finally have a child. You can have a child all this time with my son. She was like, no, I'm sticking with you. I'm sticking with God. I'm sticking with Judaism. And she, instead of going to the palace of Moab, goes with Naomi, and the two of them, absolutely destitute, return to the land of the Jews, to Judah. At that point, they have nothing. And it's a time of the harvest. And Rus says, okay, I'll go as Torah allows, amid all the poor, to collect the grain so I can have something to eat. So we can have something to eat. Just one second. All right, back. So she goes collecting, and on the first day she's there, she happens, of course there's nothing happens, but we'll call it happens, to go to the fields of Boaz, who was a rather close relative. He was a cousin of her deceased husband. He was just actually a widower himself, and he was very wealthy. He was very noble lineage. He was very, very righteous. He was a leader of the Jews, the judge, and he was 80 years old. And Boaz notices her, and Boaz is kind to her, and Boaz sort of tells his men to create a situation that she should be able to gather far more than she normally would be able to, and thus continue the harvest. And as this is continuing, Naomi, Rus's mother-in-law, who loves Rus very much, is sort of hoping against hope that Boaz would decide to perform the ceremony called yibum and marry Rus as a fulfillment of this commandment to marry a close relative's widow, since he had no children, as we're going to discuss it more at length today. And nothing happened. The harvest is over, nothing happened. Naomi tells herself, well, he was busy during the harvest. After the harvest, nothing happens. Naomi's like, we got to do something, because I can't go and ask him. It's sort of like impudent and inappropriate. Here's, we're so poor, and Rus is a convert. I question the concept of conversion from Moab to marry them. I don't know, but we got to do something, because then again, Naomi, as we explained, had really this double reason, a double loyalty. to Rus, who she loved very much and wanted to see her married to Boaz because he was such a righteous, holy person, and Rus was such a righteous, holy person. So it was a great match. And also to her dead son, Machlon, who she knew if Rus could do this yibum marriage, it's called in English a levirate marriage, this would bring peace to his soul. So for both reasons, she really, really wanted Rus to marry Boaz. And she tells Rus, listen, go in the night and go to him while he's guarding his harvest and appeal to him then, which Rus does, with all the details as we discussed last week. And as we left off, the next morning, Rus goes back to Naomi. Naomi said, what happened? She said, I don't know. Are you getting married? I don't know. He didn't say he's marrying me. He said he's going to take care of the situation. He said I should trust him. I don't know what he's doing. Naomi said, okay. If he said he's going to take care, he's going to take care. He's a very, very, very righteous person. We trust him. We don't know what he's going to do, but we trust him. And that was exactly where we left off, which was the end of chapter 3. So now we're about to begin chapter 4 and see, what did Boaz do? What did he mean when he said, don't worry, I'll take care of it? No, he was very reassuring. As we remember, we said, wow, this is very righteous. He wasn't like, what are you doing here in the middle of the night? You are terrifying me. Who do you think you are? Get out of here. He was very kind. He was very compassionate. He was very understanding of her plight. He didn't say, I'm going to marry you. But he said, like, I'm going to take care of the situation. So what did you take care of the situation? So before we do that, I wanted to just explain a little bit more, because that, of course, is going to be the focus of today and what Boaz does. Explain this idea of the yibum marriage. Now, this idea, which again in Hebrew is called yibum, and in English is called the levirate marriage. The first time we see this in Torah is when Judah's son, the firstborn of Judah, dies. And Judah says to his next son, Onan, okay, you go marry Er's widow, who was a very, very righteous, holy woman, very beautiful, righteous, and holy woman named Tamar. And why was Judah telling his second son to marry his first son's widow? Well, this is the concept of this marriage, that if there's a couple that are married, technically they have the ability to produce children, but they don't have any children for whatever reason. Maybe they did things to prevent themselves from having children, or whatever reasons happened, they did not have any children, but physically they were capable of it. Then there is an obligation on the closest relative, which since the giving of the Torah we refer to only as a brother, to marry the widow in order to have a child, and that child will continue the legacy of the dead man. So in the Zohar, which of course is a foundational work of Kabbalah, it explains that when a person passes away, this doesn't remove him from his roots on this world. Our roots on this world are eternal, because our children carry on our role in our life in this world. So if someone dies childless, then your mission on earth isn't being continued and it's not being fulfilled. So this is considered a tragedy. In other words, as long as someone has a child, who has a child, who has a child, not only do we have a spiritual life that continues obviously forever, as the soul is a spiritual entity that doesn't die, but also on the physical plane, our life continues forever through our progeny that continue and continue and continue. And as they continue, they are fulfilling our mission on this world. But if someone dies without children, it stops. There's no one now here to continue your mission on this world. So that's why God said that the widow and the brother should marry to have children. And that child that's born from the levirate marriage, from this yibum marriage, is the receptacle for the soul of the dead man, of the original husband, so that his mission on life can be completed through the children of his widow and his closest relative. So that is how the Zohar explains the concept of the levirate marriage of yibum.
Mrs. Stern?
Yes, Rama.
This is a little off topic, but I'm just curious if, like, when Mashiach comes, you know who your descendants are, like your relatives, even though spiritually you're not technically related.
You're saying from previous lifetimes or from this lifetime?
No, from like this lifetime, like when Mashiach comes, like, will I know my children? Well, chas v'shalom, that,
Your children?
obviously.
Why wouldn't you know your children?
I mean, like, because aren't you not, like, sinners change, or like, right? If you sin, you're not going to look like they say, like, that other people are not supposed to know that you sin, so you're going to look different. I don't know. That's what I was told before. I don't know if that's true.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but no, the family unit will stay intact, and you will know your children. Your children will know their mother. Not only that, but it says that if a woman ever had a miscarriage or a stillborn, those children will be born, like everyone that will have the resurrection of the dead. Those children, any miscarriage and any stillborn, will also be born and will come to their mothers. So somehow they'll know the address as well. Now, I don't know if they're going to be born as newborns, in which case they're going to be like delivered to your home. I don't know the technical details, but I know this is what Torah says. I know it's true. But definitely the people living at this time are not going to lose their awareness of their family relationships.
Or like past people.
You're saying previous lifetimes?
No, like, let's say my great grandmother. Will she know?
Will your great grandmother know who all of her descendants are?
Yeah.
Is that your question? I don't know. It says probably for 4 generations. It says a relationship, says the compassion on your children descends for 4 generations, which means your children, your grandchildren, and your great grandchildren. That's as far as it goes. So I don't know if past that, but I would assume through great grandparents, there would be bonds. Yes, there would be an awareness. But I think if this is my great great grandmother, I don't know if she know who you are, because she probably have a lot of great great grandchildren. If it's your great grandmother, then yes, I would assume that as far back as that, that's probably as far back as people would still maintain a contact. I mean, imagine the sizes of our families, with everybody around. Thank God. So we're talking here about the levirate marriage, and we're explaining, according to Kabbalah, we just brought a source from the Zohar, why this is a necessary institution. Now, again, biblically, one does not have to do this. As we explained before, Torah gives, written, both are biblical, 2 options. The option of this marriage, or the option of a ceremony called chalitza, which is like an official disengagement, a separating of the bonds between the brother and this widow. Now, obviously, in any case, this situation only exists if there were no children and if there was a brother around that was still alive during his deceased brother's lifetime. Meaning, if someone passes away and 3 months later his mom gives birth to a baby boy, that doesn't count because they didn't live together in the world. But if someone passed away and he has a baby brother who's a year old, it does count. And then there's the obligation either of the levirate marriage or of the ceremony of chalitza to separate this brother from this widow, and both can be free to marry other people. And they don't achieve this goal. Nowadays, as we said, we don't do this levirate marriage. Ashkenazim have not done it for generations, and Sephardim also stopped doing it about 100 years ago, because our sages said we're not holy enough to really get married as the Torah is saying. Not for ourselves at all, but for the man to really get married, to help his dead brother have a child, that the child is really not going to be his. The child is really going to be his dead brother's. It's a very high, pure level to get married for your dead brother and to have a child and raise that child for your dead brother. Take care of the woman for your dead brother. So our sages said we're not on such a level. We're not, we could do it, but if we did it, we'd be doing it for ourselves. We wouldn't be doing it for the reasons God's ordaining. And therefore nowadays, no one does yibum. That is not allowed. That option, though it's a biblical option, is not allowed for us because of our level. And everyone does chalitza. Ashkenazim for many hundreds of years, and Sephardim at least for the last 100 years. But going back to biblical times, this was what happened. So again, we gave the Zohar's explanation of the person needing a child in this world, progeny in this world, to continue and fulfill their mission. Another source explains that a man and a woman, a husband and wife, are considered like one body, like one unit. So through this levirate marriage, the wife is perpetuating her deceased husband's life. In other words, it's as if when her husband passed away, a part of her body died. And the closest relative, the brother, because he and the deceased are products of the same parents. So through him, she's able to like keep alive this part of her that, so to speak, died when her husband died. Now, before the giving of the Torah, this concept of the levirate marriage was known to the very greatest people of those generations, like Judah. So, and Judah knew that this concept didn't only apply to a brother. In the absence of a brother to marry the widow, a close blood relative could also do this to correct what happened because of the dead man's absence. So when Judah married Tamar, of course, he didn't know what he was doing, but when he married Tamar, this was a yibum. This was a levirate marriage. The child that was born was perpetuating his first son, heir's legacy. After the Torah was given, when the Torah was given, the Torah is saying this is the mandate of brothers. We view it as brothers. But we see, actually based on the story, we see very clearly that in earlier times, the levirate marriage was also done not only by brothers, but by close relatives. Now, in our situation here, as we're going to discuss today, the person who was technically considered the closest to Machlon, to the deceased husband of Rus, was a man named Tuv. He was Machlon's uncle. He was Machlon's father's brother. Elimelech's brother was Tuv. He was the closest blood relative to Machlon. And therefore, he was considered first on line to do this yibum marriage with Rus. If he had done so, and they had a child, that child would perpetuate Machlon's legacy. That child would be considered spiritually Machlon's child. That child would fulfill Machlon's job in this world. That child would give again life back to Machlon and that part of Rus that was Machlon. After Tuv, the next closest relative was Boaz. Boaz was a cousin. He was Machlon's cousin. His father was Elimelech's brother. So he wasn't an uncle like Tuv, who was considered closer as an uncle. He was a cousin of her deceased husband, and he was considered next on line. And in those days, again, because people were far holier than they are today. Today we say we don't even do this because they're not holy enough. But they were also holier than in later times when this was done, but only with a brother. Here, the Jews acknowledged like a moral responsibility to provide a resting place for the soul of the deceased, for the soul of the departed, by having an offspring with his widow. So that's what we're discussing today. So if we look inside chapter 4, we're up to verse 1. Boaz, meanwhile, had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Just then, imagine that, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken passed by. So Boaz says to this man, he said, come over, sit down here, Ploni Almoni. And he, the man, came over and sat down. So what are we talking about here? So if we remember, in the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up and there's Rus. And they have this very strong conversation. And then Boaz says, just go back to sleep, like it's not safe to walk the roads at this time of night. She went back to sleep early in the morning before anyone was up. She woke up, Boaz woke up, he escorted her to Naomi's house. He even then didn't think it was safe for her to walk alone. She goes in and tells Naomi the adventures of the night. Boaz, in the meanwhile, now we're picking up the thread of what happened to Boaz. Boaz leaves Rus off and he continues walking. Where's he going? He went to the gates of the city. Why did he do that? Because he had just made a promise to Rus. He had promised Rus he would take care of her situation. Now, really, Naomi wanted Rus to marry Boaz. But when Rus is in a very modest, delicate way, asking Boaz to marry her as the redeemer, as the levirate marriage, Boaz had responded, well, there's a relative closer than me. Now, Naomi wanted Boaz because Boaz was so holy. He was the righteous man, most righteous man of his generation, both for her dead son's sake and for her daughter-in-law's sake. That was the person she wanted Rus to marry. But Boaz was saying, well, technically, I'm not in line to do this levirate marriage, because the levirate marriage goes from the closest relative. Again, really, from the biblical perspective, it seemingly is only brothers, but in those days, in lieu of brothers, as obviously here there was no brothers because his brother had died as well, will be the closest relative. And he said, I'm not the closest relative, so I'm the wrong person. You're turning to the wrong address. Now, it's not like Naomi didn't know this. Of course, Naomi knew that the levirate marriage goes to the closest relative. And of course, Naomi knew about her brother-in-law, her husband's brother, too. But she didn't consider him because he was just a regular person. And she wanted a special person. She wanted Boaz, who was so special that he was literally the judge of the generation. That's who she wanted to marry Rus and to help her dead son's soul. So from both levels, she wanted Boaz. But Boaz said, hey, technically, it's not me. You're coming to the wrong person. I'm going to take care of you, meaning I'm going to go to the right address and I'm going to try to get him to do it. So he goes to the gate because he promised Rus he would take care of it. And he took his word very seriously. And he was the judge and the head of the Sanhedrin, of the tribunal court. And that's where the court would meet, by the gates of the city. Now, again, when we think of a gate, don't think of it like, there's like gates, like maybe a gate outside your house. If any of you have ever been to Jerusalem, you could think of the gates around the old city of Jerusalem. So the gates themselves are very thick and extend for miles. So the gates means here something far broader than we can envision a gate. It was a pretty large edifice. And that is where the tribunal court, the Sanhedrin, convened. That is where Torah was taught. That is where the disputes were settled. And therefore, Boaz went there to meet with his court and to try to resolve this matter for Rus. So he just goes and sits down. Now you could say, hello, you promised Rus that you're taking care of her. You go early in the morning to the gates. How are you going to take care of her? How is that taking care of the situation? But he knew that there was nothing he could do. What he could do was put himself by the gate, ready and waiting for something to happen. And he was confident that God would deal with it, as God did. And I think that's also a beautiful lesson for us. There's so many lessons in this book that we're studying. I think that's a very beautiful lesson that obviously we as humans do everything in our power. And then we turn it over to God. And we can be very confident and very relaxed and very trusting that we're doing our part and he's doing his. So Rus and Naomi had done their part. I mean, they had crazy done their part, right? Naomi had concocted this whole scheme of Rus going in the middle of the night. That's really going out on a very big limb to try to make this happen. And Naomi put all of her merits on the line and all of Rus's merits on the line. So spiritually and physically, they had done their part. And Boaz said, I'm going to do my part. I'm going to the gates. Well, there were no cell phones in those days, no emails, no, what's he supposed to do now? He's going to assume that God's going to send the person he needs. And that's exactly what God did. Of course, you could say, well, if I was as righteous as Boaz, I could be a bit more relaxed. But obviously, the Boaz was far more righteous, and obviously, this is a far greater issue. Perhaps this is the whole lineage of David and of Mashiach, on the table. But I think for ourselves as well, this is a very important lesson. We are responsible for everything we can do, and when we've done everything possible, we're responsible to turn it over to God, exactly as Boaz did. So Boaz is sitting by the gates, and just then, the verse says, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken passed by. Just then he came by. And the Midrash says, what's going on? How did he just then pass by? And the Midrash says, because God brought him. God made sure that he would come exactly at that moment to take care of the situation. And the Midrash says, it doesn't make a difference where he was. If he was in the other end of the world, God would have made sure right at that second he would be passing by. So Boaz, who is quite righteous, shouldn't have to be just sort of waiting and waiting for it to happen. God right away is going to take care of the situation, which again is sort of continuing the same theme. We do everything we can. We trust God to do everything else, and he comes through. He comes through. Boaz said, I'm doing my part. I'm sitting by the gate. That's as much as I can do. God says, no problem. I'm having this man walk right by just to fulfill your trust in me. It says in the Midrash, Boaz played his part. Rus played her part. Naomi played her part, right? Naomi was involved to move the story along. Rus was involved to move it along. Boaz was involved to move it along. They all did their parts. Whereupon God said, I too must play mine. So when you do your part, when you do whatever you can, God says, me too. I'm also going to do my part. I'm also going to continue whatever needs to happen here for the sake of the situation. It's interesting because the word, it says, and behold, the Redeemer just passed by. And behold, just then, is saying it's sort of unusual because it was unusual, because it wasn't normative for this man to be in this place. Boaz was waiting for him, just assuming God was going to have him show up, and God did. It wasn't normatively part of the places he would be. In other words, Boaz had made a promise to Rus. Boaz said, I'm going to take care of it. And there's a Redeemer closer than me. And I'm going to speak to him. And I'm going to explain the situation to him. So Boaz had given his word to Rus. So God made it possible for that to happen. So it's very interesting because this person has a name. I don't know. It seems like this. I don't know why. Okay, better. Sorry, my screen seemed like all fogged up. This person has a name. I even told you his name. His name was Tov. But in the verse, it does not say his name. It didn't say his name before. It just said there's someone. And now when we're talking about him, it doesn't say his name. It says Ploni Almoni, which is actually a term since after this is recorded in Rus that people use to say, mean like, I don't know how to put it, so-and-so, whoever, Mr. Anonymous. It's like a term for a person that we don't know his name, but we know his name. His name is Tov. We clearly know his name. The sages clearly speak about his name, but in the recording of the writing of the book of Rus, it does not say his name. It says Ploni Almoni, so-and-so. It's like a pseudonym. So why don't we say his name? Too. Why do we say Ploni Almoni? So some say we don't say his name because he messed up. Again, Naomi really didn't want him to marry Rus. But that doesn't take away his obligation. He was the closest relative. He was an uncle. And therefore, he should have stepped up to the plate and married Rus. And as we're going to see, he refuses. So because he didn't do what he was supposed to do, we don't want to say him by name. We're sort of, Ploni means something hidden, Almoni means someone nameless. We don't want to say the name of a person who we don't have positive things, so to speak, to say about him because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. Others say Ploni Almoni, an Almon is like someone who's mute, who can't talk. Because he was mute, meaning wordless, devoid of knowledge. Because the reason why he didn't want to marry Rus is because he was like, I can't marry Rus. That's I don't know, she's a Moabite convert. And Boaz is like, no, it's only the men that are the issue, not the women. And he was like, I don't know, I don't want to mess up my lineage marrying Rus. So he was empty of real Torah knowledge that he wouldn't trust Boaz and the authority of the tribunal court to marry her. Now, we don't imagine that when Boaz spoke to him, Boaz said, "Hey, Ploni Almoni, whoever you are, whatever your name is." Obviously, Boaz knew him very well. This is Boaz's uncle. Remember, it's Machlon's uncle. It also is Boaz's uncle, because Boaz's father, Machlon's father, Elimelech, and Tov were all brothers. So obviously, Boaz knew his uncle well, and he knew the name of his uncle well. So obviously, when Boaz referred to him, he didn't refer to him as Ploni Almoni, whoever you are, so-and-so, come here, sit down, I want to talk to you. But again, almost as if not to embarrass the person who behaved this way, the scriptures isn't writing his name. Especially because his name, it doesn't seem like he fulfilled it. His name was Tuv. Tuv is the word taiv, which is good. So his name, reflecting his essence, is saying he's a good person. But we don't view him in this situation as being a good person because he didn't live up to his familial obligation. He refused to marry Rus. And we view that as something wrong on his part. Again, it's not like he got punished for it in a certain way or this or that. He lost his chance at marrying this great tzaddikus, this very, very, very holy, righteous convert.
So
But we view it. Yes, Rachel.
But if he is Boaz's uncle, Boaz is 80, so he's very old.
We don't know how old he was because we don't know. It's very possible. Boaz's father had already passed away. Boaz's father wasn't an option. So it's possible in the family line that, you know, Boaz could have been older than Tuv.
No.
In other words, there was Tuv, there was Elimelech, and there was Boaz's father, whose name was Salmon. So we don't know the ages, but I'm just saying it's totally normative. I mean, think of my children, right? I have a 31-year-old and I have a 7-year-old.
But uncle is usually older.
But I'm saying, in theory, it doesn't have to be.
Doesn't.
Because if Tuv was much younger than Salmon, he could be 70 and be the uncle of Boaz, who was 80, or they could have been both been 80. It doesn't seem, what you're saying is a very good point. The reason why I'm assuming that Tuv was not older is because our sages view it that Boaz was very old. Like, I don't know that I would view 80 as so very, very old. Maybe very, very old in terms of being able to produce a child. Remember, the whole goal of this marriage, of a yibum levirate marriage, is to have a child. That child carries on the soul of the deceased. So Boaz is turning to Tuv with an assumption that Tuv can do this. That Tuv can marry Rus and have a child with her. And our sages are viewing it that it was a miracle that Boaz did it. That Boaz, who was 80, they view it as an absolute miracle, an absolute act of, obviously, every formation of a child is a miracle and everything that happens is an act of God. But they view it as a nature-defying act of God that Boaz was able to produce a child that night. So I would assume, but this is only my assumption, because no commentator, I mean, what you're saying is very logical, but no commentators go in that direction at all. So my assumption is Tuv was the same age as Boaz and possibly younger, because Boaz was assuming that he could marry Rus and have a child. And I'm just saying it's possible in the family lines, you know, there are plenty of situations where uncles are younger than nephews, depending on, you know, the ages and stages of everyone involved. So since Boaz is assuming Tuv can produce this child, I would assume he was of age as Boaz and perhaps even younger. But it's a good question.
But like, if Tuv would have said yes, then would Mashiach have come from them then? Because it was supposed to be from both of them, Boaz and Rus.
Guess what?
So,
Tuv didn't say yes.
no, but I'm saying, so it's a good thing. So we shouldn't think of it as a bad thing.
That's an excellent point that Frum is saying. I'd like to focus a little bit on Frumma's point. Did you hear what Frumma said? Frumma said something very interesting. she asked, because again, we know this marriage, this child that Rus and Boaz produce is the line of King David, is the grandfather of David. Rus and Boaz were the great-grandparents, being great-grandparents of David. They have a child, Ovid, who has a child, Ishai, who has a child, David, who has a child, Solomon, who ultimately has a descendant called Mashiach. So Rus and Boaz getting together, which is why there were so many obstacles, is to produce the line of David and the line of Mashiach. So from a said, so speculating, if Tuv had married Rus instead of Boaz, would Tuv and Rus have produced David and Mashiach? And my response was, well, guess what? That didn't happen. That wasn't God's script. God's script wasn't Tuv. God's script was Boaz. Boaz was the holiest person of his time. And obviously they're both from the house of Judah, but the holiest person from the house of Judah, and therefore really the person worthy of drawing down this soul that's going to be ultimately the grandfather of David, to produce the father of David, to produce David. It was a complete line of perfectly righteous people. Rus was perfectly righteous. Boaz was perfectly righteous. Their son Ovid, which means servant of God, was perfectly righteous. He had a son Yishai who was so holy that the Talmud says he only died because of the bite of the snake, meaning because of the original primordial sin. Yishai was so perfect. One of the few people that we're told is so perfect, we don't even know how God took him, who had a child David, one of the 5 holiest souls of all time. So obviously Tuv was not meant to produce this lineage, would not have been capable of producing this lineage, and was not meant to marry Rus. So then Firma said to me, so then what are we blaming him for? That's a very interesting point that she's raising, which is a very interesting point in this work. Are we blaming him? Yes. He did the wrong thing. As I just went through all these explanations of the sages, why doesn't it say his name? Well, we don't want to embarrass him because what he did was wrong. Well, we can't call him Tuv because Tuv means good, and he didn't do the good thing because he didn't live up to his familial obligations. Well, he was like an Alma, mute, devoid of Torah, because he didn't accept or know the Torah principle that you're allowed to marry a Moabite, just not a Moavi. So we're clearly looking at it that he was wrong, at least, if not bad. But God didn't have it in the cards for him to marry Rus. That's got nothing to do with it. Meaning, it is also a very important theme to understand. We do not write God's script, and we don't read God's script. We have our human obligation to look at life as it's served to us and to deal with it, and to serve God faithfully in whatever situation that's in front of us. God is running the show. He knows what's supposed to happen, who's supposed to marry who, what child's supposed to be born, where you're supposed to live, what children you're supposed to have. Everything's in God's hands. But I can't live my life that way. I can't say, listen, everything's in God's hands, so I don't have to do anything because whatever God wants is what's going to happen. Is that a true statement that whatever God wants is going to happen? It's an absolute true statement. But he wants my efforts. Can I say, a very simple little example, can I say, listen, it's determined at Rosh Hashanah how much money I'm going to earn this year. That is true. So what should I bother working for? It's already after Rosh Hashanah. We're already in Adar, actually almost up to Pesach. It's almost 6 months after Rosh Hashanah. What should I waste my time working? God already declared 6 months ago how much money I'm going to earn this year. Obviously, I've only learned in about half. So I'm going to stop working. God's going to send me the money. Now, is it true that God has myriads of ways of sending us money? That's absolutely true. But God wants you to go to work. Why? Because he wants me to function. He wants me to do my responsibility in his world. He wants me to step up to the plate and take action, like we were just describing before. Naomi didn't say, well, if God has it ordained that Rus and Boaz have to get married, it'll happen. I'm going to do something so inappropriate and tell Rus to go in the middle of the night. No, I can't do that. Rus is going to say, I'm going to go in the middle of the night. No, I can't do that. Boaz is going to say, I'm going to go sit by the gates waiting for Tuv, who's never around in this neck of the woods. Like, that's crazy. Each one of them did their maximum and trusted God. And that's what we have to do as well. So even though, yes, in God's script, Tuv was never supposed to marry Rus, but that doesn't in any way remove his responsibility for not marrying Rus. because he's not operating on, well, whatever God's script is what's going to happen. So if I'm supposed to marry her, it's somehow going to happen anyway. He had to do his responsibility. You're the uncle. You're the closest relative. Here, there's a situation. Her dead husband, he needs someone to perpetuate his memory. You're the one that should be doing this. He said, no, I don't want to get involved. Sticky situation. I don't know if it's so kosher. I'm not interested. That was wrong on his part. Never mind that God had no intention of him marrying Rus. It was wrong on his part that he made a bad choice, which of course was part of God's script, but he chose to make the bad choice. And the truth is, if it's a little hard to follow, this is true for all of our lives. God has his script and we make choices. And sometimes my wrong choices are part of God's script. I make mistakes, part of God's script. I do the wrong thing, part of God's script, but I still have personal responsibility for all my wrong choices and all my mistakes, because I'm not doing them because I know God's script and that's why I'm doing these things. I'm doing these things because I'm making a choice. So we have responsibility for our choices, and fear not. God's script is what's going to happen. Any other questions on this? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure, Menucha.
Yes, if Naomi knew about Tuv living in the same city, right? And she knew the rules that he was next.
It's not clear that he lived in the city, because the point was, as the Midrash was saying, it was very unusual for him to be at the gates. He lived somewhere in the area of Judah. We don't know where he lived, but that was actually the point the Midrash was making, that like
she knew about his existence.
She knew he existed. This is her dead husband's brother. He had two brothers, Elimelech, Tuv, and Salmon. Salmon was dead. Elimelech was dead, and Tuv is her dead husband's brother, and Naomi definitely knew about his existence.
Yeah. So she probably knew that he was the closest, like next in line.
She absolutely did.
And why she didn't try to arrange the marriage between Ruth and Tuv?
Because she didn't want Ruth to marry Tuv.
But it doesn't matter. She had to follow the law.
Well, from her perspective, right? Boaz is saying we have to follow the law, and we have to go in a hierarchy of the closest relative. Naomi, maybe as a woman, she felt there was a little wiggle room here. She was saying, Tuv is a relative, Boaz is a relative. I want Boaz. Why did she want Boaz? Our sages say because she knew he was so holy, and she wanted Rus to marry someone that holy. She was even, it says, I don't know if I went into this with you, but even it says at a certain point, she was sort of like, after they had already met in the harvest, and Naomi sort of got her radar, her antenna up, sort of hoping that maybe something would happen and Boaz would reach out to do this levirate marriage. She was already like talking to Rus and like sort of telling her how holy Boaz was, how wonderful this would be. In other words, Naomi was looking at it like, Rus is probably not going to want. She's 40, 40 seems pretty young to me. She's 40. She's a young woman, relatively speaking. Boaz is 80. He's an older man. Why would Rus want to marry Boaz? And she didn't have to marry him, meaning according to Jewish law, in the whole concept of the levirate marriage, either the woman or the man could say, no, I'm not interested. And then they would do the ceremony called chalitza, and that's how they fulfilled their biblical obligation. So Naomi was concerned that Rus wouldn't want Boaz. But Naomi really wanted Boaz because she knew he was so holy. So she was like already prepping Rus to want Boaz because he's so holy. So I think it's irrelevant. You're saying it's irrelevant because how was she going for Boaz when Tuv was around? The sages seem to just accept that she was saying Boaz is going to be the one. That's where my womanly intuition, I'm going for Boaz. And Boaz is the one that raises the issue of like, hey, you're approaching me to do my obligation. It's not my obligation, it's Tuv's obligation. But even there, and again, I don't think I went into all the commentary last week on it, but some of the commentary on the verses explains that Boaz was implying to Rus, there is another relative that's closer, but knowing him, I doubt he's going to do it. And if he doesn't do it, I will do it. So it seemed, so in Boaz's head, based on this commentary that I don't think I shared last week, I might have, I think I might have skipped those, that Boaz assumed that Tuv was going to say no. Boaz knew Tuv's personality, and Boaz knew that Tuv was a little too boxy, a little too square, a little too, I don't want to do this. I don't think it's so safe. I don't know if it's so kosher. Boaz is like, hey, I'm the head of the Sanhedrin. I'm telling you to do it. I'm telling you to do it. I'm telling you it's kosher. And Boaz was like, no. Tuv was like, I don't want to mess up my lineage. I don't really know if this is such a kosher option. So Boaz knew in advance that Tuv would probably say no. And he had already said to Rus the night before, if he says no, I'll do it. So possibly, I'm saying this to answer your question, possibly that was Naomi's reasoning as well. That possibly Naomi knew that going through Tuv would just be a formality. At the end of the day, she knew Tuv would never do it. And that's why she was pinning her hopes on Boaz. I mean, she wanted Boaz because she knew he was so holy. But she was also directly approaching Boaz because to her, Tuv maybe was just a formality because she knew he would never say yes. And she had hope, maybe, because Boaz is so righteous, he would do it. So maybe that's the answer. No, I didn't see any commentary. I saw lots of extensive commentary on this work. Many commentators on this. I didn't see anyone that directly addressed that issue. But I would assume probably one of those two answers is the correct answer.
In those days, though, they had a lot of nevuahs, right? So how would Tuv not know? Maybe he knew that he wasn't supposed to be married to her.
Nobody whitewashes him from her.
I feel like maybe he knew. I don't know.
The same thing I said before. That's not how we operate. We have an obligation to do what God wants. The right thing to do would have been to marry her. That's considered the spiritually right choice. It wasn't like he was a sinner for saying no. You could do something that's wrong, it doesn't make you a sinner. He wasn't a sinner for saying no. But spiritually, the right choice would have been to marry her. And that's why it was viewed as a disgrace on his part that he didn't step up to the plate. And instead, he was so worried about his own righteousness, which is an interesting lesson we see here as well. You're so worried about your righteousness that you mess yourself up. Oh, I've got to be so holy. And really, he ended up doing something not so nice. Again, it worked out. Boaz married her. They had a child. It all worked out happily, not ever after, sort of, but it did work out. In the ultimate cosmic scheme of things, it worked out. But Tuv didn't know that. Tuv didn't know that Boaz said, okay, if you won't, I will. Tuv didn't know that. Tuv knew Boaz, the judge of the generation, the leader of the Sanhedrin, was telling him, I'm telling you it's kosher. I'm telling you you're allowed to. I'm telling you it's your obligation. And Tuv said, I don't want to do it. Redeem her land? Yeah, I'll pay for the land. I don't mind doing that. Marry her? No, I'm not going to marry her. I don't want to sully my name by marrying her. So that was wrong with him. Sometimes we have little inklings. We do sometimes have little inklings in our head. But if the inklings are going in a different direction than God's will, we're not supposed to follow the inklings. We're supposed to follow God's will. So we are going to stop at this moment. We, of course, are talking a little bit ahead of ourselves because we really don't know yet exactly what to have said, that we sort of spoke about it. Let's do, I did need to end on time today, but let's do a law. So what we're up to talking about, we're still talking about things like sort of in the preparatory stages of Shabbos. Remember last week we spoke about the idea of machines, that we can't turn on machines that make noise to run on Shabbos because that would consider inappropriate for the Shabbos. So today we're discussing the idea of food. Now we are supposed to, it's actually considered something we're supposed to do, is to have hot food on Shabbos, to honor Shabbos and to show our allegiance to the words of the sages that explain to us how we can have hot foods on Shabbos. Of course, we're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. So so this is all focusing on like Friday stuff. So Friday stuff that you're supposed to make sure of is any food that you want to be cooking on Shabbos to maintain its heat must be ideally half cooked or minimally, this is minimal, so don't really go for it, but minimally a third cooked when Shabbos comes in. So ideally, really, of course, the food should be completely cooked, but we want the food at least half cooked. And if for some reason you didn't get it half cooked, at least it has to be a third cooked by the time Shabbos comes in. That's in terms of a food that's cooking. If in terms of a liquid like a soup, when Shabbos comes in, the soup already should be hot. Or if you're boiling water, the water should already be hot. For you to maintain it and because in other words, a food changes as it gets cooked. Like if you have a raw piece of meat, the fire changes it. So once it's a third cooked, a third cooked is considered like barely edible, but edible. Half cooked is considered more edible, and completely cooked is considered edible. So that food, once it's cooked, it's cooked. In other words, if you cooked a food and it was completely cooked and then it cooled off, it's still completely cooked. But a soup or hot water or any type of liquid, once it cools off, it's not considered the same anymore. And therefore, anything that's a liquid that you want to serve hot on Shabbos has to be hot before Shabbos comes in. So when you're scheduling your cooking, if you want to maintain this food to be maintaining its heat on Shabbos, which nowadays you can either have like an electric, we call in Hebrew a plata, like a hot plate. My tip, if you want to keep your food on a hot plate, heat it up first on the fire. It takes an awfully long time to heat it up on a hot plate. But then you could transfer to the hot plate. Or people put it directly on the fire with a piece of metal. We have to have the fires and the knobs covered. So you can have a piece of metal, which in the Yiddish is called a blech, which really means a piece of metal, covering the fires, covering the knobs. And then you could put your pots before Shabbos on the flames or around the flames, wherever you want, on, next to, far, close, whatever's good for you, before Shabbos. Again, as long as the food is at least a third cooked before Shabbos. And if it's a liquid like the soup, then it is hot. It is going to be hot before Shabbos. Because if it was less than a third cooked, then we are cooking it on Shabbos, and we're not allowed to do that. If the soup's not hot and we're making it hot on Shabbos, that's considered cooking it on Shabbos. We're not allowed to do that. But if the food is already a third cooked, it's already cooked. So we're more like maintaining its heat. The soup's already hot, we're maintaining its heat. We're continuing the process. That's allowed. But the basic, a third cooked of a solid or hot of like a liquid, has to happen before Shabbos comes. And then the food has to be either on like an electric hot plate or a flame on your range covered by that piece of metal that covers the fires and covers the knobs. If it's an electric hot plate, which doesn't have any knobs and doesn't have any fires, obviously, you don't need to cover anything, you just put it on. If it would be, let's say, like a hot pot, like one of those slow cookers, like, people put cholent in sometimes, something like that, then the knob of that electric pot should also be covered before Shabbos, the same way you cover with the blech, the fires and the knobs of your range. So if you have a, I don't know why my brain's escaping the word right now, but like a slow cooker or something like that, that's not the term for it, but you know what I'm talking about. You also, for the same reason, should take like a piece of foil and cover the knob, because we're supposed to cover all knobs before Shabbos, as a visual sign to ourselves not to touch it on Shabbos, because we're not allowed to adjust the heat on Shabbos. Any questions on that law? That is very practical and very relevant. It comes up every Shabbos. And I have to myself make sure, because if I cooked the food a while ago, it's cold, make sure that I heat it up so when Shabbos comes in, it's already going to be hot and not cold when Shabbos starts.
Can it be also warmed up in the oven, an oven on the timer where it turns off before you open the oven?
You can do that, but again, it's the same law that applies. Before Shabbos, the food has to be at least a third cooked, and the food, especially something like the soup, has to be hot when Shabbos comes in. But then you can maintain the oven's time. Again, it's not such, I'm saying yes, generically, obviously speak to your rabbi about the specific laws, but the general concept, yes, works. That you could have a timer that the oven will go off. Yeah, so when you open the oven's no longer on.
If it's on Shabbos mode, the light will not turn on.
Right.
And
And the
if
oven's already turned off.
if the timer is set correctly, so what can be a problem then?
Right, as long as the timer, everything is off, the oven is off, everything is off when you're gonna open that door. Because when you open the door, if the oven's running, it's a problem.
Yeah, I learned that.
If the oven's completely off and you're not turning on any lights or anything, yes. But again, I'm saying that doesn't take away this law, which is the food has to be at least a third cooked, the food has to be hot when Shabbos comes in.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about this? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining. As we're learning this, I think it's such a fascinating work, the Book of Rus. I think there's so many lessons in it that are so relevant, and I think it's amazing. Yes, me too. All right, I also have to go to another class right now. But thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.